Thank you. I'm going to try to use this mic, but I tend to wander. So if I wander off mic, just wave me back, please. So there we go. The official abstract is sitting there. And so what I really would like for this to be is an opportunity for us to discuss some concerns that I had when I was starting, and if you have other concerns, to add those to the pile. I came to this conference for the first time in 2003 and decided to start using little pieces of IBL. And the first thing I was worried about, the first two things I was worried about was I am not yet tenured. I was like a first-year faculty member. So I was terrified that my student evaluations were going to be awful, and that was going to mean that I didn't get tenured, even if I was doing things that I thought were good for my students. And I was worried that my students would come back and say, she didn't grade me appropriately. She had this holistic, because there were a lot of the old guard at the time who said that they graded holistically, that at the end of the course, they knew what their students knew, and they could therefore assign a grade, and they understood their students very well. And I said, that's great, and I believe you because you've been doing this for a long time, but I'm a second-year faculty member by the time I started doing this. And if I try to say, I holistically understand what you know, and therefore I'm assigning you an A or a B or a C or an F, that if I don't have documentation to back that up, I could end up in a great deal of trouble. So one of the questions I asked when I was first starting was, okay, what do you do? So my big concerns were, how do I accurately reflect the work done by my students? How does that become part of their grade? How am I pretty confident that I am scoring the person that I like a whole lot, who's doing really great presentations, the same as the person who does really great and mathematically correct presentations but annoys me? Because we have them occasionally. I had a student this last spring who every time he sat to take a quiz or an exam, he bounced his foot loudly. It's hard to think that you're assigning the same grade to that student as you are to the person who's sitting quietly in the back and not going every 4 seconds. So, you know, I want some numerical. And then related, of course, how do I defend that record? If I were called into the dean's office because I gave all of my students A's and nobody ever gets an A in this course, I want to say, yes, here's what they did this semester, here's how I scored it, here's how I kept a record of it, they all did fabulously. And similarly, if I had a group where I had nobody do well and the high grade was a C, I wanted to be able to say, here was what I told them the expectations were. Here's my record of what they actually did. They didn't match. And they got many reminders about what those expectations were. And at some point, there's only so much I can do. So I wanted to keep track of these things somehow. And then I was also worried about how do I explain these expectations to my students. You sit through these, I see several faces in the room I know, so you have some IBL experience maybe, you know what a good presentation looks like and a bad presentation looks like, you know what good mathematical content, we all do, looks like and what bad mathematical content looks like. But how do I get that across to them so when I say to them, no, you didn't earn full points for today's presentation, they're not like, why not? Right? They need a checklist, at least at the beginning. And then they start to see what good presentations look like also. But at the beginning, they need something like, if I just do these 6 things, then the professor will be happy with me. Modulo sum, right? And then how do I convince my students that the presentations are expected and valued? So I was either brave or incredibly wimpy that first semester. It depends on kind of your perspective. So I was at a school where nobody was doing anything IBL. Nobody was doing presentation stuff. The math ed courses were doing group work, which is a pretty typical situation. But nobody else was doing anything inquiry-based learning or student-centered or activity-centered. There was a lot of lecture, a lot of quizzes, a lot of exams. I was at Sam Houston State. The place has changed very much since then, and there are a lot of people doing really amazing things there now. But back in the day, there were not so many of us trying these new things. And so if you just put in the syllabus, and I'm going to make you get up, and this is not something that's part of the culture of the department, they're like, well, I don't have to do that in any other class. I'm not doing it for you either. Yes, you will. So how do I coerce that? I mean, convince them that, right? How do I convince them that this is important and valued and necessary for the course? And there was some conversation yesterday during Nina's talk, for those of you who are in the room, about coercion versus convincing that it was important, right? And that grades can be coercion, and so that's where I kind of fell. And I'll give you some specifics on that in a minute. But I wanted to be very clear with them that this was not an optional part of their grade, even though at first it was something that was happening just once a week. I started off just doing presentation days instead of full-blown presentations all the time. It's once a week, but what's the right number then? If it's 5% of their grade and then they're only supposed to do it once a week, then nobody's gonna get up. Because it's 5% of their grade, and if you have an A student, they don't need to get up because they already have their A. And if you have an F student, it's not going to pull them up to a passing grade for 5%, so why should they get up? It's those people in the middle who might, which is maybe enough, but it doesn't help the people on the extremes. So, I'm gonna share with you 2 of my grading plans. This one is from Intro to Proofs, which is obviously a proofs-based course, but for the record. And I just weighted everything equally. Now, again, kind of in order to defend my grades to my chairman, to defend the grades to the students, to defend the grades to the dean if necessary, I wanted to have regular old in-class exams that are very typical in-class exams. I want to be able to say that somebody comes out of my class and knows the same things that somebody who comes out of another Intro to Proofs class. When they go on to analysis, do they know how to do proof by induction? Do they know how to do a proof by contradiction? Do they know what a contrapositive is, right? And so there's certain standard things that I want to have pure on those exams so I can show mastery. So when somebody who's teaching real analysis gets one of my students and says, this student's doing very well, I can say, well, I expected that because here's their final, testing the normal things. 10% for presentations for my students historically has not been enough to motivate them to get up to the board and take things seriously. Even a full letter grade somehow does not seem to be enough motivation. I'll show you the next grading plan. You'll see that, well, you'll see 2 things, but presentations are not quite at 20% because it's not a proofs-based course as much. But 20% seems to get them to the board and let them know that they really have to do this. This is kind of, my dividing line is somewhere around 15 or 20%. And because I feel like I still have to defend my grades a little bit, I generally don't make that higher. I know plenty of people who do, and some of them are in this room, who make presentations worth 25, 30, 40% of the grade. Rock on. I can't do it. Okay, for DISCRETE this last spring, okay, so I don't want to necessarily have to run the mic around, but what do you notice? I can repeat it. Yeah, so yes, okay, so attendance and class participation is a part. It's also only 15%, right? And it's a different label. I'm not calling them presentations for this group of students. I'm calling it class participation. Class participation means presentations, but I don't want to tell them that the first day. You'll see kind of excerpts from my syllabi, and I can always send you this actual syllabus, but I'm pretty sure the wording on the syllabus says, students will be encouraged to share their work when called upon to do so. Sneaky, huh? Yeah, so they will be encouraged to share their work, and then there's some caveats to that, and again, I'll get to them in a second, but it doesn't say you're going to be presenting every day. They are, and they soon realize their fate, but I don't, for this particular group, this group for DISCRETE was math majors, computer science majors, and middle school certification people. It's a very diverse group, and a lot of you I know have DISCRETE classes that run this way. So I don't want to, somehow it's the middle school people who get scared. Right? But they're going to have to talk, right? They're going to have to teach, they're going to have to stand in front of people and explain mathematics, but they're like, I can't get up, I'm so afraid. I'm like, oh, we're going to have issues. But they come around really quickly. So let's deal with a couple of the easy bits for me about assessment first. Presentations are the hard bit, I'm saving that for the end. Homework. I'll show you how easy I make this. In my non-proof courses, I don't pick up homework. Easy to grade. Okay? There's a motivation for doing this. One is that at Slippery Rock University, where I've been the past 4 years, I've had about 140 students per semester and no grader. We're not allowed to have graders. So if you have 140 students per semester, my DISCRETE class was 35 this spring, and you're trying to pick up homework and return it in a timely manner, it's not going to happen. So rather than end up with these stacks of things on my desk that I'm never actually going to look at, I just tell them I'm not picking up homework. A lot of work is done at the board, so they know how problems go. And I replace homework with quizzes, which are much more concise, much easier to grade. I'm not looking at 7 problems, I'm looking at 2, and they're in the same spot on the quiz paper, which automatically makes grading more simple than trying to figure out where in the world do they put problem number 7, right? In my proof-based courses, so I shared this with a colleague who took this wording, not realizing what I had done to him. So in my Intro to Proofs course in particular, and I apologize for these being long, but I wanted to give you the actual wording I use, and I can always email slides or syllabi to you later if you're curious. I do perpetual homework. So homework problems are constantly assigned. They always have a sheet of problems that they're working on. They are constantly handing in problems, which means I'm constantly grading. That was the part I didn't tell my colleague. But they're constantly handing in problems. I pick them up at the beginning of class every day. They put them on the pile at the front before class starts. And some days there's, for 30 students, 60 pages, because I also make them, you'll see on the next slide, hand in one problem per sheet, because that makes my grading a ton easier. It's really bad for trees, and I apologize, but life is what it is sometimes. And I assigned a ton of problems, and at first I picked up all of them. This is how this evolves over time. At first I picked up all of them. So they would have like 40 open problems, and everybody would be handing in all 40 problems, and I was like, okay, this is dumb. I can understand if they know about induction by looking at 4 of their induction problems instead of 15 of their induction problems. They need a summation induction problem, they need an inequality one, they need a divisibility one, and they need like something wacky, right? Like there's an infinite number of primes. If you can do those 4 types of problems, and we're teaching them to think critically and to do problems, not to regurgitate problems, if they can do those 4 types of problems, they can do any induction problem I throw at them. Yeah, I see Sue, and I'm like, yeah, modulo that. But, but at least I have an idea that they're capable of these things. And so I started asterisking, is that a word? Now it is, thank you, certain problems, and I would only pick those up. And so I was grading a ton at first. When I was picking up all of them, I was grading slightly less when I did this. And for those to be collected, everyone's on a separate sheet of paper. You can hand them in at any time in the process. If something has not yet been presented, you can earn up to 10 points on it. So you're encouraging them to get stuff in early before they just see it at the board. But there are certain things I do want them to know how to do. I want them to know how to prove that the square root of 2 is irrational when they come out of my proofs course. Preferably the square root of p, but the square root of 2 is a good starting point, right? And so that one I'm always going to pick up, and I want to make sure that people write it up. So I don't want to just pick them up before presentation. If they didn't get it and then they see it, they should also be able to replicate, hopefully not regurgitate, but replicate that proof with their own words and their own explanation. And we all know that the stuff that gets written on the board, either by ourselves or our students, is not the complete story. And so they do have to fill in those gaps for me to give them full credit after a presentation. So they actually have to be complete proofs, even if the stuff that's written on the board is like square root of 2 equals p over q. Q times root 2 equals p, right? I mean, that's not enough. They have to give me words in between. They can earn, say, a 7 on a pre-presentation problem, and they might be fine with that. It's not perfect, but they had a lot of really good ideas, and they missed some, like, bookkeeping or phrasing. They could have done a little more explaining, but they had all of the key ideas there, and it was before it was presented in class, so I'm pretty sure they either looked it up or they did it. Right, I'm going with they did it. And then after presentation, it's an all or nothing. So after a presentation, it's a super easy read. If something gets presented incorrectly at the board, I do sometimes let it stand. Nobody threw anything, that's awesome, thank you. So if it's been presented but incorrectly and people start handing things in, they all start getting these things back with zeros on them, and they're like, what happened? And I was like, proof's not correct. And they say, but that's the way it was on the board. And I say, yes. And Another thing I learned is I used to let these go on essentially until the exam. So they would be able to rewrite and resubmit as long as they wanted until I got tired of reading the logic problems, and then I would say no more logic problems. Or until I got tired of reading the set theory problems, and I would say no more set theory problems. And this would go on, so I would be getting things like weeks later. This was an incredibly bad choice. It seemed great at the time. It seemed really lovely for the students, but the day before the exam, I'd get like 75 papers from one particular student. I was like, you didn't do anything until today, thanks. And so this became the next caveat. If you're unhappy with your score, you can resubmit them up to 3 class periods after the problem's been presented in class. So, for instance, Tuesday, Thursday class maybe. Problems presented on Tuesday. Students should go home and reflect on what just happened and write it up for Thursday. A lot of them did. I grade it and get it back to them for Tuesday. They can take that feedback and resubmit it one more time on Thursday. So that's why the 3 class periods instead of 2 or 4, because that was my return cycle. I was grading like a fiend, okay? Because you would get these stacks of proofs and you would have until the next class period to turn them around. And maybe that's okay in a Tuesday, Thursday class, but on Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, that was really rough. But this worked for me, and it gave me a cutoff point for those problems. It is a little rough for bookkeeping. So in my spreadsheet, where I had all the problems listed, would also somewhere write next to the problem the date that it was presented and the last date it would be accepted. And after that last date it was accepted, I would highlight that row, or that column, whichever way you're going, so that I knew that nobody could submit that problem any longer. And so once you kind of develop this bookkeeping, it really helps. But I was like, oh, well, how am I going to do this? 3 class periods. I'm going to get this wrong all the time. But the highlighting really was like, no more of those. And so something would show up in your pile that was problem number 45, and it's already yellow in my grade book. I'm like, sorry, too late. It's very helpful.
Jackie?
Yeah.
So what was your turnaround rate? Would you get it the next class period?
I always returned things the next class period, and if not, I would give them a 1-day extension on those problems. So if something happened in my life or I was at a conference or something like that, I'd be like, you know, these were due Thursday, but you can have until next Tuesday to hand them back. But I always got things back next class period.
And then if somebody didn't submit their first one until 3 class periods, they don't have an option.
If somebody did not submit until that 3rd class period after presentation, they did not get an opportunity for rewrite. That was their fault. So I did not give them 2 resubmissions. I gave them 3 days, 3 class periods, because I was just like, I can't keep track of how many times you've submitted. That's just, and I would just honestly, in my grade book, I would just write over if they resubmitted. So some people try to keep a record of all of the submission grades. No, I'm sorry, I couldn't do it. So if they had a 4 on the first submission, and then they resubmitted it after the presentation, and then got a 5, I just replaced that cell. Just write it over. I don't care what they did before. In order to compensate, and actually I did this in my proofs course, so here's where my grading nightmare starts, continues maybe, but I also do this in my DISCRETE course, or any course that I teach, is that they get quizzes almost every day. They're like 1 or 2 question quizzes. They're frequently vocab quizzes, because say you're in an abstract algebra class, but you don't know what a group is. How many problems can you really do? So there might possibly, no, you weren't in my abstract class. I was like going to be somebody in the room who had this happen to them, where literally the word group was on the vocab quiz every day for about 2 months, because there were people who were still missing it. And I was like, are you guys sensing a theme yet? And they said, you ask us about group every day. And I said, yes. Why do you think that is? And some of the better students went, there's some people who still aren't getting this. And I said, great. Guess what's going to be on tomorrow's quiz? And they went, group? And I went, fabulous. Do you think you can write down for me next time? And then I rolled my eyes just slightly, but you know, you can't help it after a while. Or if there's a proof that you've been like, it's been on the homework, and it's been on an exam, and it's been on the rewrite for the exam, and then it was on another problem sheet, and you really want to make sure they can do it, sometimes that showed up on these quizzes. And the quizzes, again, are really easy to grade because they're short and they're well organized. And then exams, 2 standard exams plus comprehensive final, always, again, so I can kind of defend myself and I know or feel like they're ready to go on to the next course if I'm giving them a grade that says that. All right, now I'm ready. Okay, presentations. Again, it's a long quote, I apologize. There are kind of 2 schools of thought, probably a lot more. at least 3. Schools have thought about how do you figure out who to call on for presentations. There's the I'm going to choose you randomly, which is what I usually tell them I do, and then I stack the cards. It's random, right? They just don't know what the random organization is. Your card happened to be on top 3 days in a row. I don't know why. So I have them write out note cards the first day. It has their name and their email address and then some interesting facts about them, so it helps me learn their names, especially when there's 35 of them. So it's like, you wouldn't know this by looking at me, but I have 17 tattoos. I have 6 puppy dogs. I grew up in Mexico. I don't know, like whatever, right? So that when I'm reading the cards, I'm starting to actually know my students a little bit. And I've started to add, like, math is ... Fill in the blank and don't worry about being politically correct, but don't cuss too much. You know what I mean? And so then I would randomly choose the cards. And I tell them that I'm random, and then sometimes certain people end up on top of the pile. Actually, one semester I got in trouble because, trouble in quotes, I got in trouble because one of my students was literally called first, like 7 days in a row. There were only 9 people in the class. So maybe the chances of this happening were not too far off. But she was like, oh my gosh, every day. And so I finally started letting other students pick cards, so it didn't look like I was somehow always going to her card. So I'd spread them out on the table and have somebody else pick, and then move on. So you can pick them randomly. The other thing that I've done kind of a lot is by a priority list, that the students who have the fewest presentations get first dibs. And since I'm not worried about my problem set going in order, I'm not worried about the next person has to present problem number 15. They can present anything that's open. This is fine. So the students who've gotten up the fewest number of times can have choice of whatever is still open, because they are having some issues getting to the board. Either their stuff is always gone when they get called, or they're not prepared, or they're, I don't know, not comfortable or whatever. So I give them a chance to have access to an easier problem, hopefully easier problem. Easier for them is what I should say. And then the other way, which I've also done and I've backed away from, is a volunteer method. I do this very early in the semester, and then I quickly move to either a random or priority list where I'm just like, okay, who has something they want to share? But what happens if you do that? Either you get nothing, or the same 4 people who always have stuff, or the same person. Yes. Right, so Sarah Marie said that if she has a minimum number of presentations that have to be done over the semester, then sometimes people either realize they're not at their minimum, or they want to get that minimum over with so that they can kind of like breathe for a little while, and they will volunteer, and I absolutely agree with this. This is kind of why I use the priority list, is I don't actually always know, especially for a new prep, how many problems are going to exist for the semester, and so setting that minimum is hard for me. I mean, if I have 30 students and 90 problems, then I know at least 3 per student, but if I don't know that there are going to be 90 problems and I'm trying to set some kind of minimum, I can get myself into a corner. So that's why I generally don't do that, but it absolutely works, you're right. So there was one semester, it was a Calc 3 class, it was all presentations. And what I had them doing, because students were not working as well as I would have liked, what I had them doing was emailing me ahead of time to tell me what they had. And then of the people who had problem number 17, taking the person who had the fewest presentations and calling on that person in class. So they didn't have to volunteer in class. I knew ahead of time that something was done, which was actually a problem with this particular group. And one day we got to class, and only one person had sent me an email, and I always give them a chance to sign up at the beginning of class. Does anybody else have anything they want to put their name on? And nobody, just that one person who would talk to me ahead of time. And I would try to catch them in the hall and be like, hey, do you have something for today? Great, I'll write it down. And really only one person had emailed me, and I was like, what does this mean? And so we walked into class, and I said, does anybody else want to add? And they said no. Well, they didn't say anything, right? And I was like, okay, well, somebody told me they have 45. Go ahead and do 45. Student sat back down, said, nobody else has anything? And they all looked at me like I was crazy, because I just asked them this question. I was like, well, somebody has 46. Same student gets up and does 46. Same student gets up and does 47. After problem 49 or so, I was like, I think we'll call it a day, but you guys now know you have some work to do. See you later. And I mean, I'm not really into public shaming, but I was really frustrated that they weren't working harder. And this was enough actually for them to know that somebody was doing the work and was doing the work well, because the presentations were good and correct. And once they saw the problems, they were like, oh, if I'd spent 5 minutes on that, I probably could have done some of those or had a start on some of those. I mean, I'm not saying they were easy problems that had been presented, but they surely were not like prove Green's theorem, right? And they all had entry points. And so, yeah, I felt bad. I kind of embarrassed that student that day, but I actually more embarrassed everybody else. And so it worked out just fine. I do cover for them so that if I'm doing this random selection, they do get 2 days where they can just say, I don't have anything. I didn't sleep, I lost my notebook, my dog ran away, I had an English paper, I don't have anything. After that second pass, they have to get to the board and they have to try something. They don't have to finish it, but they have to try something, which is terrifying. So most of them don't use the passes very early, and when they use them, they then are pretty well motivated. I had this last semester a student who actually just wasn't coming to class, and so in the end, she used 8 passes because, her name kept coming up on my priority list, and she kept not attending. And I was posting the priority list to D2L, so they knew who was supposed to be up next. So I actually went back and took a bunch of points off of her presentation score. Actually, I didn't, but I could have. I didn't have to. Okay, and so how do I encourage my students to have any idea of what they're supposed to do? Well, here's the quote. I write in the syllabus that you're supposed to be paying attention to what's going on and you're supposed to be asking questions. And I tell them that they're not supposed to be working with others. Like, again, I can email these, so don't worry about writing all that down. And actually, let me leave that up for just a second. So one thing that I started doing a little bit later is I have a spreadsheet for each student for every class period. I print a new one every day. And there's a column for just being there. There's a column for if you give a presentation that day, and I write down which problem you presented and how many points you earned. I'll get to the point in a second. And then there's a column for asking a good question, not a how was your night. Asking a good question, giving some kind of oral contribution, like somehow saying something that's helpful to the conversation, or saying like, hey, that's just like problem number 36 that we did 2 days ago. That's mathematical insight, that's drawing connections. They get 2 points for mathematical insight, 1 point each for a question or a comment. And for a while, I actually had like 5 columns, I guess, attendance, P, Q, C, and I. And actually, just attendance earned you 2 points. Just being there earned you 2 points. When asking a question, earned you 1. Because I'm glad that you're in class. That means for most of my students that they're actually paying attention. And so they get credit for paying attention. The conversation in Nina's talk yesterday was about how do you grade presentations? Is it an all or nothing? Do you grade them at all? And for me, it was, I want to reward people who get up and do a very nice and mathematically correct job. So a correct presentation, even if not the most polished thing I've ever seen, will earn you 5 points. If there's a small mathematical problem, but it doesn't affect the validity of your argument, that's 4. That's if nobody fixes it, by the way. They have a chance to stand at the board and fix whatever's happened. 2 to 4 really means like you made a good college try, and I essentially give 1 point if you got up to start a presentation and got immediately stuck. Like you wrote down the problem and then realized your first line was a fallacy, for instance. You get a point for trying, you got up there. But there's not really much that would contribute to our mathematical understanding. So I do ask them to write the problem up, make sure they're clear about what technique they're using, and explain. And I don't want anybody to say, and actually there's more words that should get added to this, I don't want anybody to use the word easy, because easy for you is not easy for me and vice versa, and there'll be a problem that I get very quickly one day that somebody else in the class didn't understand at all, and the next day they'll present something that I've been staring at for 5 years, you know. And same thing for defending your work. They have to be able to explain their steps, they have to be able to defend, and they have to not talk down to the audience. That's really what I'm trying to encapsulate kind of in the middle, is politeness, right? But when they're new to this, and most of them are really good about politeness because they don't want somebody to be rude to them when they're at the board. So they're not going to go out of their way to deliberately say something mean. But you want them to have certain guidelines. I want them to have certain guidelines if they're new to this process about, like, you might not think that the word stupid is insulting, but it is. So we're not going to use it. Same thing with easy. Oh, you didn't understand the easy part? Yeah, not a good way to respond to your audience, right? As we all know. And I try really hard at the beginning. I'm very lenient about this top bit. Because I want people engaged and I want them talking, but they're supposed to ask questions and not suggest alternative means. So they're not supposed to say, hey, did you try? Doesn't that look like a mean value theorem problem? That's not, I mean, that's a question, but it's not the kind of question we're asking them for. And we're trying really hard to emphasize in my room that there are many different ways to do the same problem, many of which are correct. And just because you did it using mean value theorem doesn't mean nobody else can do it a different way. And so my grading and handouts continually evolve. I get ideas every year from this conference and from talking to people about things that did work. I know several people in the room have really nice rubrics that they use. You should ask around and see who they are and get theirs. And so, again, kind of take as many ideas. I've stolen all of these ideas from different people. And I've taken the pieces that work for me and gotten rid of the pieces of their stuff that don't work for me. The holistic grading didn't work, for instance. But keeping track of everything, because I'm kind of OCD that way about presentations and questions and attendance, and that works for me. But some people are like, that's way too much paper, I can't handle it, so don't take that piece. But hopefully it's given you some food for thought, and like I said, other people in the room have really awesome rubrics. But one of the things, in case, especially for new users, in case you haven't noticed, is that you have to be incredibly flexible and adaptive when you're doing an IBL situation, and that can be really, really hard to know that today you need to put up 5 problems, but yesterday you only did 1, and how do you manage to keep moving? And that's experience and asking lots of questions of other colleagues. There was one down here too.
Hi, I'm Gary Richter from Southwestern University. I'm thinking that it's pretty obvious that one of the stars of this conference is Mike Starbird. He gave a workshop Thursday morning and talking at the dinner. He gave a workshop at Southwestern this last semester, and during the course of it, somebody asked him, what about grading? What do you do with grading? And he paused a moment. He was thinking, and he said, you know, I don't really know the answer to that question. And if Mike Starbird is not sure, that gives us permission to struggle with this, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And there are different concerns for like experienced IBLers in terms of grading to kind of finesse this and make this, you know, more accurate, more comfortable, more whatever. And new users who I think just need an entry point. And sometimes that entry point is, you know, and like I said, this evolves for me, and I'm sure it evolves for Mike, so.